My grandmother had a way of smiling that you could feel before you saw it. It started in her eyes, this quiet warmth that spread slow and certain, like the first light coming through a kitchen window on a winter morning. It wasn't performative, it wasn't for anyone, it was just her. My brother's smile, the one he wore the day he showed up at her funeral, was nothing like that. His was wide and practiced, teeth forward, the kind of smile you put on when you're trying to convince a room full of people that you belong there. He hadn't visited her once in 3 years, not once. And I know that because I was the one who was there every single time. Let me back up. My name is Lee. I'm 31 years old and I work as a registered nurse at a mid-size hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. I've spent most of my adult life learning how to take care of people, not just medically, but in the quiet, unglamorous ways that don't show up on any chart. Sitting with someone while they're scared, holding a hand during a procedure, staying an extra hour because a patient has no one else and the night feels too long. I learned all of that from my grandmother Helen, or Grandma Helen as I called her from the time I could talk. She raised me, not fully, my parents were alive and technically present, but in the ways that count, in the ways you feel in your bones when you're grown. She was the one who shaped me. My parents divorced when I was 6. My dad moved to Phoenix and started a new family almost immediately. My mother, who struggled with her own demons for most of my childhood, did her best, but her best was inconsistent in the way that leaves marks on a kid. Grandma Helen stepped in without being asked. She lived 20 minutes away from our house, and for years, more days than not, she was the one picking me up from school, making sure I had dinner, sitting at the kitchen table while I did homework, asking real questions about my day, and actually listening to the answers. She was the one who came to my high school graduation when my mom was having a hard week and my dad sent a card with a $50 bill and a note that said he was proud of me. She sat in the third row in a yellow blouse she'd bought specifically for the occasion. She cried before my name was even called. When I got into nursing school, she called every one of her friends to tell them. When I graduated, she hosted a dinner party at her house and made her famous lemon pound cake, the one that took 2 days and 3 bowls to prepare, and she stood at the head of the table and gave a toast that made everyone cry, including my two aunts who had never particularly liked each other but stood there dabbing their eyes in unison. She was my person, and I was hers. My brother Scott was 7 years older than me. He'd left home at 18, gone to college in California, and built a life there that had very little room for family. I don't say that to be cruel, it's just accurate. He called on holidays, sometimes. He texted on birthdays, occasionally. He had a wife, a daughter, a career in tech sales that he talked about in the vague, self-important way of someone who doesn't want to explain what they actually do. He and Grandma Helen had never been close, not for any dramatic reason, just distance, time, the slow drift that happens when someone makes a consistent choice to be elsewhere. She loved him because he was her grandchild and she was incapable of withholding love from people she was connected to. But their relationship was surface level, holiday calls, the occasional birthday card. That was it. When she got sick, I was the one who noticed first. It was a Sunday in March, almost 4 years ago. I'd driven over to have lunch with her like I did most Sundays. She'd seemed a little off, slower, more tired than usual, getting confused when she tried to tell me a story she'd told me a dozen times before. I chalked it up to a bad day. She was 78. Everybody had bad days. But the next Sunday was the same, and the one after that. I took her to a primary care doctor, then to a neurologist, then to another neurologist for a second opinion. The word they used was vascular dementia, and they explained it in careful, measured terms designed to soften the blow. But there's no softened version of that word when it's your grandmother sitting in the chair across from you looking slightly confused about why everyone in the room seems so serious. I told my parents, I told Scott. My dad sent a sympathetic email. My mother came to visit once for 3 days and spent most of it talking about her own anxiety about mortality. Scott said, "That's really hard, Lee. Keep me posted." And that was the last I heard from him for 2 months. So I handled it. That's the thing people don't tell you about being the capable one in a family. You don't get a vote, someone has to do it. And once it becomes clear that you're the person who will, everyone else quietly steps back and lets you. I started spending more time at her house, then I started spending most of my free time there. I rearranged my schedule at the hospital to pick up more day shifts so I could be with her in the evenings. I hired a part time maid to come in 3 mornings a week when I was working. I managed her medications, her doctor's appointments, her bills. I learned everything there was to know about vascular dementia, the progression, the symptoms to watch for, the conversations that help, and the ones that don't. There were hard days, days when she didn't know my name, days when she thought I was her sister who had passed away 15 years ago, and I would just go along with it. Because what else do you do? Days when she was frightened and nothing I said could reach her, and all I could do was sit beside her and hold her hand and wait for the fear to pass. But there were beautiful days too. Days when she was sharp and present and funny, when she would tell me stories about her life before I knew her, about meeting my grandfather at a dance in 1968 and knowing within 20 minutes that she was going to marry him, about raising 3 children in a house with one bathroom and somehow surviving it, about the trip to Italy she and my grandfather took for their 40th anniversary that she described in such detail it sounded like she was still there. On one of those days, about 2 years into her illness, she took my hand while we were sitting on the porch and looked at me with the kind of clarity she didn't always have anymore. "Lay," she said, "I need to talk to you about something." I told her we could talk about anything she wanted. She said she'd been thinking about her will. She'd updated it, she said, with the help of her attorney. She wanted me to know that she had taken care of things. She didn't tell me the specifics. She wasn't that kind of person. She would have found it crass to talk about numbers. But she wanted me to know that she had been intentional, that she hadn't forgotten what the years had actually looked like. I told her she didn't need to explain anything to me. I hadn't been there for a reward. I'd been there because she was my grandmother, and I loved her, and there was nowhere else I wanted to be. She smiled at that, the real smile, the one that started in her eyes. "I know," she said. "That's exactly why." She passed away 40 months ago on a Tuesday morning in October with me sitting beside her. It was quiet. The hospice nurse had told me it would likely be that day, and I had called in to work and just stayed. I held her hand. I talked to her, even though I wasn't sure how much she could hear. I told her about the lemon pound cake and the yellow blouse and the toast she'd given at my nursing school graduation. I told her she was the best person I had ever known. I didn't think I've said anything truer in my life. The funeral was small, the way she would have wanted. Close family, a few of her oldest friends. Her neighbor Ruth had known her for 30 years and showed up with a container of homemade soup because she didn't know what else to do, and that felt like the right thing. Scott flew in from California. He stood at the reception afterward with a glass of wine and a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he spoke about her in the past tense with a fluency that surprised me, given that he'd had so little to say about her while she was alive. He told one of her friends a story about something she'd done when he was 12. He laughed at the right moments. He did everything correctly. I was from across the room and felt something I didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something sadder than anger. Something like grief for a version of a family that had never quite existed. His wife, Monica, was pleasant in the careful way of someone who is aware she's in the middle of something and has decided to be neutral. Their daughter, who was about 8, was bored in the sweet, unself-conscious way of children at events they don't understand. After the reception, Scott and I sat at Grandma Helen's kitchen table, the same table where she'd helped me with homework for years, and he asked about the estate. I told him I didn't know the details yet, that her attorney had been in contact and there would be a meeting the following week. He nodded and something in his face shifted just slightly, not dramatically, just enough. The attorney's name was Mr. Calloway, a quiet man in his 60s who had handled my grandmother's affairs for over 20 years. He met with me first, alone, because Grandma Helen had specified that in her instructions. He told me she had left me her house and the majority of her estate. She had left a meaningful sum to her church, a small bequest to her neighbor Ruth, and a modest amount to each of her 3 children, my dad, my Uncle Frank, and my Aunt Carol. Scott, as a grandchild who had been in minimal contact, was not included separately. When the full meeting happened, with my dad on video call from Phoenix and my Uncle Frank and Aunt Carol seated in Mr. Calloway's office, the will was read clearly and without drama. My dad's reaction was hard to read through a screen. My Uncle Frank seemed unsurprised. My Aunt Carol cried, though I think the tears were more about the reality of losing her mother than the specifics of what she'd received. Scott was not at the reading, but he called me that night. The conversation started calmly. He said he thought there must have been some kind of mistake. He said he knew how much our grandmother had cared about him. He said that surely she hadn't intended to leave him nothing, that she would have wanted things to be equal. I told him what Mr. Calloway had told me, that the will had been updated 2 years prior, that she had been of sound mind at the time, and that her attorney had documentation of her intent. His voice changed after that, not dramatically. Scott had always been the type to express anger in controlled, precise language rather than raised volume. He said that he had always assumed the estate would be divided fairly among the grandchildren. He said that he felt I had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. He said that it was troubling that I had inserted myself so completely into her life during her illness. I sat very still on my couch and let him finish. Then I said, "Scott, I was there, you weren't. That's the whole story." He hung up. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from an attorney in California. Scott was contesting the will. The grounds cited were undue influence, the claim that I had manipulated my grandmother during her diminished mental capacity to alter her will in my favor. I read the letter twice. Then I sat down on the floor, which is something I found myself doing in moments of overwhelming feeling, and I stayed there for a while. I called my own attorney, a woman named Patricia. No, wait. I called the woman I'd been referred to by a colleague, an estate litigation attorney with an office downtown. Her name was Mrs. Hartley, and she was exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when someone is trying to take something that belongs to you, calm, precise, and absolutely unintimidated. She told me that undue influence cases in North Carolina required the contesting party to prove a specific set of circumstances, that the beneficiary had a confidential relationship with the deceased, that they had actively procured the will, and that the transaction was suspicious given the circumstances. She said that my case was strong. She said the documentation would be key. I had documentation. 3 years of medical records, appointment logs, caregiver notes, receipts, text messages, phone records, a daily journal I had kept, not for any strategic reason, just because one of the hospice resources I'd read had recommended it as a way to process the experience. Statements from her doctors, from the aide who had worked with us, from Ruth next door, from 2 of her friends at church who had seen us together regularly. And then there was the video. About 8 months before she passed, during one of her clearest stretches, my grandmother had met with Mr. Calloway and recorded a statement. She'd done it, he explained, because she had anticipated this. She had known her family well enough to know that her choices might be questioned, and she had been, in her methodical and quietly fierce way, prepared for it. In the video, she sat in a chair in Mr. Calloway's office in a blue cardigan I recognized, and she spoke directly to the camera with the kind of composure that made your chest ache to watch. She said her name and the date. She described her estate and her intentions. She explained in clear and specific terms why she had made the choices she had made. She talked about the years of care. She talked about what it had meant to her. She said she was of sound mind, that no one had pressured her, that these were her wishes and hers alone. Then she looked at the camera and she said Lee was there. Every day. That's all I have to say about that. It ran to about 12 minutes. I watched it for the first time in Mr. Calloway's office, and I cried so hard I had to step outside afterward and stand in the parking lot in the cold for several minutes before I could speak again. Mrs. Hartley submitted everything. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in February in a county courthouse that smelled like industrial cleaner and old paper. I wore the same grey blazer I wore for job interviews. I arrived early. I sat in a row near the front and kept my hands folded in my lap and tried to breathe normally. Scott came in with his attorney about 10 minutes before the hearing started. He was wearing a different suit, also expensive. He didn't look at me when he sat down. Monica had not come. When they played my grandmother's video, the room got very quiet. I watched the judge. She was a woman somewhere in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed upon her head and a deliberate, unhurried way of holding herself that I had found reassuring from the moment she entered the room. She watched the screen with complete attention. She did not look away. When it finished, Scott's attorney made his arguments. He was capable and professional and presented the case as cleanly as it could be presented. He emphasized the caregiver relationship, the schedule changes, the time I had spent at the house. He described it with chosen language as isolating. Mrs. Hartley responded, point by point. She submitted the documentation. She called the hospice nurse who testified about Grandma Helen's expressed wishes in the final weeks. She submitted the statements from the doctors. She entered the daily journal. Then the judge spoke. She said that the burden of proof in undue influence cases was substantial and that the evidence presented by the contesting party fell significantly short of meeting it. She said that caregiving, even intensive caregiving, did not constitute undue influence. She said that a person of sound mind and the medical documentation supported that Grandma Helen had been of sound mind at the time of the will's revision, had the absolute right to distribute her estate according to her actual experience of her relationships. She said, and I remember this specifically because I wrote it down in my car afterward. The fact that this estate was not divided equally does not make it unjust. Sometimes the most just outcome is the most honest one. The case was dismissed. Scott left without speaking to me. His attorney gathered his papers. They walked out through the heavy courthouse doors, and that was that. I sat in my seat for a moment after most people had cleared the room. Mrs. Hartley put a hand briefly on my shoulder and said I'd done well. I thanked her. Then I thanked her again because it felt insufficient the first time. I drove home and changed out of my blazer and sat in my kitchen for a long time. The house, Grandma Helen's house, which is now technically mine, though I still think of it as hers, needed some repairs that I'd been putting off while the legal situation was unresolved. The roof, a section of the back porch railing, the kitchen faucet that had been slow for 2 years and that she had always waved off because she didn't want to bother anyone. I've been working through the list slowly. I'm not in a rush. The lemon pound cake recipe is written on a card in her handwriting, tucked into the back of a binder in the kitchen. I've tried to make it 3 times. The first 2 were wrong, too dense the first time, flat the second. The third one was close. Not exactly right, but close. I'll keep trying. Ruth still comes over sometimes. We have coffee on the back porch when the weather allows, and she tells me stories about my grandmother when she was younger, before I knew her. Back when she was a woman with small children in a house full of noise and a husband who made her laugh. I could listen to those stories for hours. I think about what Grandma Helen said on the porch that day, that she had been intentional, that she hadn't forgotten what the years had actually looked like. I've thought about it so many times that the words feel worn smooth, like something carried in a pocket. She didn't owe me anything. I want to be clear about that. I didn't help her because I expected something in return. I helped her because she was the person who had shown me what it looked like to show up for someone. Really show up, without conditions, without keeping score. And because when it was her turn to need that, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. But she saw it. She acknowledged it. She made sure that what she'd decided couldn't be taken from me easily. And when someone tried to take it anyway, she had already prepared the answer. That's who she was, thinking 3 steps ahead, quietly, without making a production of it, taking care of the people she loved even after she was gone. I'm going to plant dahlias in the front yard this spring. She always meant to, but never got around to it. She used to clip pictures of them from gardening magazines and tuck them into a folder like she was saving them for later. The folder is still in the drawer by the back door. I found a dahlia nursery about 40 minutes from here. I've already put in the order. I figure it's the least I can do. There's a version of this story where I'm supposed to feel triumphant, where the dismissed case and the deed in my name are the point, and everything else is just the part that got me there. I understand why people might frame it that way. It's a cleaner ending. But that's not actually what I carry with me. What I carry is the 12 minutes of my grandmother sitting in a blue cardigan in a lawyer's office, looking directly at a camera and choosing, deliberately, quietly, without anyone asking her to make sure the truth couldn't be erased. She did that on her own. She saw what was likely coming before I did, and she prepared for it, because that's who she was. She didn't wait to be protected. She protected herself, and in doing so, she protected me. I think about the kind of clarity that requires, not just mental clarity, though she had that, and the documentation proved it, but moral clarity. The willingness to look at your own family without the filter of what you wish they were and make decisions based on what they actually are. That kind of honesty takes something. It takes the courage to stop pretending that equal treatment is the same as fair treatment, that dividing things evenly is the same as dividing them justly. She knew the difference. She had always known it. I was today in wonder, in the hardest stretches of those 3 years, whether I was doing enough, whether I was making the right calls, whether the decisions I made about her care, her medications, the aid schedule, the doctor she saw, and how often, whether any of it was actually right or just the best I could manage. There is no training that fully prepares you to be responsible for someone you love that much. You just have to think carefully, stay informed, and keep showing up even when you're not sure you're doing it correctly. That's what I've come to believe about intelligence. The real kind, not the kind that shows up on tests. It's the willingness to keep learning in the middle of something hard. To read the pamphlet, ask the follow-up question, call the doctor back. To not let exhaustion become an excuse for not knowing what you need to know. Grandma Helen modeled that her whole life. She was one of the most genuinely thoughtful people I've ever known. Not because she was educated in any formal sense, but because she never stopped paying attention. And then there's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The staying. Not the dramatic moments, not the courtroom, not the video, just the ordinary, unremarkable, continuous act of being present for someone across years. That's not something you feel heroic doing. Most days it just feels like doing what needs to be done. But I think it's actually the hardest thing because nobody is watching, nobody is keeping score. You have to be the kind of person who shows up even when there's no audience, and you have to find a way to sustain that when the end is still far away and you're tired and uncertain. Scott made a different choice. I don't spend much time being angry about it anymore. People show you who they are, and then you have to decide what to do with that information. I'm planting dahlias this spring. There's a folder of magazine clippings in the kitchen drawer that's been waiting long enough. That feels like the right place to start.